Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the table. We discuss issues of God and culture. I'm Darrell Bock, Executive Director for Cultural Engagement at the Hendrick Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. And my guest is Sam Allberry, who is in Atlanta, but the moment he opens his mouth, you're going to know he's not from Atlanta, Georgia. He is from the UK. Sam, welcome to the table. We're really glad to be able to have this conversation with you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here.
Pleasure. Now, Sam works with the Ravi Zacharias' ministry. He travels globally. He's actually headquartered out of Oxford, and but the discussion that we're going to have is going to be on the whole area of same-sex attraction and the issues associated with that. And he's going to help us kind of negotiate where evangelicalism is on this topic. So I guess the first question is, how did you get into this gig? What expertise do you bring to the area, and how have you been drawn into this conversation?
Thank you very much. It's personal experience is the short answer.
Okay.
So I grew up not being a Christian believer, but beginning to realize in my teenage years that I was attracted to men rather than attracted to women. And sort of just before I really had an opportunity to act on that, I became a Christian. And so then one of the big questions I had to think through was, where does Christianity and this whole issue intersect? What does Jesus think of this? What does being a disciple look like in the light of this experience? So I've had to really think this through for myself as a follower of Jesus. And I had no intention at that point of being public about it. But a few years ago, really felt the Lord leading me to kind of speak a bit more personally on the issue. And so whatever expertise I may or may not have has really come through having to wrestle with this individually. And prior to doing what I'm doing now, I was a pastor in the Church of England, so the issue often came up pastorally as well.
So let me ask you this question. So how did or didn't the church help you navigate this as you were wrestling with it once you became a Christian? In other words, what kind of support did you or did you not receive in the midst of the process?
Well, for the first several years, I didn't tell anyone. So there was no help or support because I wasn't open about it. But the reason I wasn't open about it was because nothing in the church culture I was in at that time gave me any kind of signal that this was an issue Christians deal with. So I was very much feeling a sense of shame, feeling a sense of fear that I would be rejected by my Christian community. People frequently use the word gay as a pejorative. And so all of those signals just made me feel as though I'm not supposed to be dealing with this as a Christian. Something's gone terribly wrong. And the issue was never raised in any kind of pastoral context. So for that reason, I never felt really that it was going to be safe for me to speak about this.
In fact, the culture was so clear about that it made you extremely hesitant to come forward and think about it?
It did. And eventually, a few years later, a pastor at a different church did raise the issue in a sermon he was preaching. And he raised it as a pastoral issue, not just as a kind of cultural issue. And he even said, this will be an issue for a number of us here this morning, and if that's you, please know that you're not on your own, and we would love to walk with you through this. And that was the very first time I felt as though I had permission to kind of say, oh, actually, this is an issue for me. So I did then begin to share, initially with him and then with close friends, and that was game-changing, just to have other people aware of it and to feel like I was a bit more known as a result of that. And just to have people who could encourage me, who could journey with me, just made a huge difference. It stopped being this secret thing that only I knew about. And certainly as a pastor with this and many other issues, I now see the value of actually of having, of being open, walking in the light, and just I think how much the devil must love secrecy. if it's just a secret in my head,
Mm-hmm.
the devil can blow it out of all proportion. Whereas one of the things that most encouraged me, as I shared with friends, was how they didn't react massively. They just were kind of, oh, okay, that's interesting, really appreciate you sharing that. It wasn't cataclysmic to them to discover this about me, which made me think it's not actually that big a deal. Because I had thought it was going to be this all-consuming kind of issue to raise with them. So actually, that in a sense helped me get it into a better perspective.
So I've got two sets of questions. Let me start there. How far in to your Christian experience did that experience take place? What kind of time frame are we talking about?
Probably 8-9 years into my Christian faith.
Oh, wow.
But I started actually opening up to others. So I'd have been in my late 20s.
Mm-hmm. And so I take it that the I don't know how else to describe the calmness or the naturalness with which this was accepted by those around you really helped move you ahead in terms of saying this disclosure, if I can say it this way, is worth the risk of disclosing. Oh,
very much so, and it was such a blessing. And the wonderful thing was it had the effect of making what were already good friendships even stronger, because I was suddenly sharing at a very, very personal level.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant the other person in the friendship would start sharing a bit more deeply about things in their life as well. And it just kind of put the friendship on a much, much deeper footing. So it actually was the opposite of what I had feared, which was I might lose friends. It actually gave me more intimacy rather than less.
So the good part of this story, of course, is that the people who were around you had responded well, and in the process, a good process opened up.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay, so this happened, and then down the road, I take it you pursued your discipleship, and just talk about your ministry in general first, and then we'll focus in a little more.
So yeah, I was working for a church for a number of years. Really felt more of a burden to speak to this issue, and realized we needed a few voices that could address this issue from the inside, because it was becoming such a big deal culturally. So began tentatively to firstly open up to my own church family. Once that had sort of gone well and the dust had settled, I began to write on it, initially with a couple of online articles, and then with a short book. And then really I suddenly realized at that point that there was just an enormous need to have teaching on this. This was about 5 years ago I started to speak on it. And I just had not anticipated, A, how big the need would be, and B, actually how comfortable I would be talking about it. I didn't know what it would be like talking about something that personal, but found myself actually just being able to do so quite calmly, and it didn't freak me out, didn't seem to freak other people out. So very quickly found myself getting invitations from all over the place, really, to begin addressing this. And the last 2 or 3 years working with Bradley Zacharias Ministries, there's been a lot more capacity to kind of speak into this issue as well. And my real burden, I think, is trying to help the church to kind of be places of clarity and compassion and community on this. So I try and prioritize training pastors, helping build up the local church, because I think that is going to be God's strategy on this issue, is having strong local churches.
Okay, well, that's a great overview, and that helps set up our conversation. So thanks, Sam, for sharing that. Let's transition, and let's talk about the local church for a second, because most of the stuff that we hear about happens at a national level, and, how do you step into the debate? How do you step into the cultural space? All those kinds of things. We can save that for later on in the podcast. I think a good place to start is to say, what's the core advice that you would give to people in the local churches, particularly leaders, about the tone that they set and what they say to their people about this, and how important that is for creating an environment in which someone like you would be comfortable in coming forward and trusting the community with this conversation?
I think that the single most important thing is to put this issue back in the gospel framework. It seems to me that most of the trouble we've gotten ourselves into as churches and as church leaders on this is because we've kind of abstracted the issue of homosexuality out of a gospel framework, and then we don't know what to do with it. So my main advice is to recognize the way the gospel always levels the playing field. Mm-hmm. And so not to think of homosexuality in isolation, but to think of the fact that all of us are sexually fallen and sexually broken, and to set the issue within that framework so that there's no one is being looked down on or singled out. This issue isn't being spoken into from a presumed position of superiority. If we come at it with this culture of actually the gospel puts all of us in the same boat, ultimately, then I think that will make the issue safe to talk about whatever someone's sexual struggle might happen to be. But if the baseline is, hey, all of us are sexual sinners, all of us are fallen and disordered in this area of life, just as we are in every area of life, then it becomes less of a big deal for someone to say, well, actually, my particular struggle is with same-sex attraction. So rather than having this idea that most people are sexually normal and fine, with a little struggle here and there, but then there are those who struggle with homosexuality, and that's really serious, is to try and say, no, actually, all of us are sexual strugglers. All of us have areas in this that we need encouragement, where we need to repent. And for some of us, the particular some of us will be disordered in a same-sex attraction kind of way. Others of us will be disordered in an opposite-sex attraction kind of way. And not to single it out in that way. I think that's the most important thing.
So, the challenge here, this I actually think this fits the general challenge of the offer of the gospel in the world, no matter what we're talking about, is the idea of we're all broken people, and the role of the church is to invite people into the experience of the gospel and into the transformation that God is able to bring to life by being properly connected to Him.
Absolutely, and again, we are all the same on that.
Romans 3 makes that pretty clear.
Exactly, which means whatever our own particular background is, or whatever we've done in the past, someone else might be into something we've never even remotely been tempted by, but we're still going to think, yeah, I'm no better than them. I'm not ultimately different to them. We're always far more like each other than we are unlike each other. And so the whole starting point of the gospel is human need and human brokenness. And so we've got to have that culture of, hey, the whole reason we're Christians is because we know we're not right, rather than presuming that we are.
So underneath that, I'm hearing a sensitivity to being careful not to create too much them and us in the conversation.
Very much so. And that is not to say all sins are exactly the same. They're not. But I think the starting point is as you said, Romans 3, all alike have fallen short of the glory of God. And so, again, ultimately, we are in the same boat. And then the differences we see between us in terms of our sinful nature suddenly are put in a healthy perspective. No one is fundamentally different to us. So it isn't them and us. It's all of us together. We're in this together as sinful people, as broken people. Our varieties of sinfulness will vary from person to person. So let's help each other with that. That's a good opportunity, because if we all struggled with exactly the same thing, we wouldn't be much help. Mm-hmm. So there shouldn't really be a them and us at all on this, or on anything, because it's differing and varying symptoms of the same ultimate disease and condition.
Yeah, so that's very helpful. So I take it that helps to set the kind of tone that communicates a willingness to walk in to this space with someone and to journey with them in relationship to both the invitation into and then after, let's assume that they are responsive to the gospel, an invitation to come alongside and walk with them through the growth experience that we all go through when we come to the gospel and God begins to go to work on us. Exactly. And I just think if that is our theological starting point, it will just make us people who are going to be far more approachable. Okay. Any other advice you'd give to local church pastors as they think about how to talk about this and approach it? Yes, I think the other big thing is I'm very, very strong. I want pastors to be strong on being theologically clear on this. But while that's necessary, it's not sufficient. And just because we're biblically orthodox doesn't mean our job as pastors is done. Mm-hmm. And so I'd want to say to people, if you're going to call people to submit to the teaching of Scripture on this issue as we've understood it, we need to be doing everything we can as pastors to make sure our churches are places where that calling is seen to be viable and plausible. Which means if we're calling people away from ungodly forms of intimacy, we need to be making sure our churches are providing healthy forms of intimacy. Otherwise, I think we're guilty of what Jesus accused the Pharisees of putting burdens on people they can't carry. If we're just saying, hey, you've got to be abstaining from any kind of sexual behavior that you feel inclined towards, but we're not actually providing friendship and a sense of family in our churches, then actually I think we share some responsibility if people are feeling pushed out into unhealthy forms of relationship. So, and I'm going to say this a slightly different way, but I think it's trying to make the same point. You can be right theologically on what your position is, but if your tone and relational elements aren't in place, there's still work to do. Very much so, yeah. Yeah, very much so. Because I often, when I do address this, I often say it's not just in this area, but in several areas. You can be right, but if your tone is wrong in how you approach it, you're still wrong. I mean, it's wrong in an area, but it reflects an imbalance that isn't a reflection of what the gospel is supposed to be about. Exactly, and we see a type of that with Peter in Galatians 2, where he had his doctrine right, but his behavior was. There was a kind of culture to the way that he behaved that actually undermined the gospel he believed. And if Peter can fall into that, I'm sure all of us can. Yes, yeah, great. Okay, so that's kind of the local church perspective. Now let's step back and ask some broader questions, in particular about evangelicalism as a whole and how it tends to speak into the public square. And actually, I think this is a good transition, having just discussed the right doctrine, but also the issues of tone in relationship to this. Give me your assessment of how, and this is always dangerous to say evangelicalism is this one broad, single, sweeping stroke. But with that in place, give me your take on how well or poorly we're doing. What do you think are we doing well, and what do you think we need to work at? Well, certainly I get to visit a wide variety of churches, and I get to have a bit of a wide-angle lens on this issue. And my observation is that actually the vast majority of churches I see want
to have both theological care and also that tone and sense of culture, and how can we help, how can we be a blessing. So I'm really encouraged by that. I think the disposition of the vast majority of churches that I've seen has been a healthy disposition of how can we support our brothers and sisters who are wrestling with this, how can we reach out to our friends who aren't believers, and that's encouraging on the whole. I think there are still areas where people are dealing with this primarily in the category of it's a culture war issue and are not thinking of it as a pastoral issue. So there's still variety around there, but I think certainly in the UK, and I think it's a little different in the US, I've seen broad evangelicalism actually coming together on this issue. Everyone from kind of your very conservative type churches to sort of more charismatic. I'm seeing across, I get invited to all of them to provide kind of teaching and training on this. So I've been really encouraged by that, just seeing whereas other issues have sent us all in different directions, this seems to be, in my experience, in the UK at least, an issue where evangelicalism is pretty much coalescing. In other words, those who claim to be evangelical and for same-sex relationships are now looking much more marginal. I think there's, in the US, my observation is that the evangelical world is still a bit more fragmented on this. I think it's so much bigger that those kind of smaller disagreements and discussions become much bigger because there are whole tribes in each of them. So I'm seeing the same kinds of discussions going on that we have in the UK, but in the US, it just seems to be far more heated.
Now, that's interesting because I was going to ask you what that difference was, and I've lived in the UK, so I want to explore that a little bit because I think thinking through this across culturally is another angle that is a helpful way to think about this. It would strike me, now this is a little bit from a distance, that in the UK, part of the struggle would be, and part of what makes it different is the amount of Christian believers in the UK is a much smaller percentage of the population than here in the US. That's one factor. And the other factor that I think would be in play in the UK that isn't as much in play in the US would be, in the UK, the Christians are much more mixed together given their theological breadth, whereas here we tend to be more segregated. The conservatives hang out with the conservatives and the liberals hang out with the liberals, and it's not as mixed as you get in the UK because of the state church difference, for one factor among many. I
think that's true. I think our size is a factor as well. We're just not big enough a country to avoid each other.
Yes, exactly. You all the Christians, one, you're small in number, and two, you're all together a lot. And so the liberals and the conservatives really know each other in Britain, if I can say it that way. Whereas here, generally speaking, you're speaking about one another, but you may not actually be at the same meetings very frequently and that kind of thing. So that dynamic makes for one difference.
Yeah.
It also makes for a different kind of conversation because in any given assembly, you might have that mixture of presence in the UK that you probably don't have oftentimes in the US. So that would strike me as one difference. I'm going to lay out the table and I'm going to just let you talk. A second difference that I see, and I think the reason why you see, to some degree, the heatedness that goes on is because the different groups here are big enough individually in the various groupings that they group together in that you can form very distinct identities as groups, which produces an inherent, I don't know how else to describe this, an inherent tribal element in the conversation that's probably absent to a degree in the UK.
I think that's true, and I think something that is slowly changing that is the fact that we have global connectivity with the internet. I'm seeing in the UK now a bit more of that than there has been, that kind of tribal mentality, because you can be part of a virtual tribe.
Right.
If you plug into these other guys in the States and these particular networks. But I think you're right. In the US, whatever group you belong to is probably big enough that you can live your whole Christian life in it. You've got your own seminary, you've got your own publishing house, and you don't have to do much peering over the fence to see what others are doing.
Yeah, and why they're thinking, why they argue the way they do, all those kinds of things. Here's another dimension, and you alluded to this, that I think is important. You said when this conversation becomes part of culture war, that and what I'm hearing underneath that is when it becomes part of culture war, it risks being pulled away from the gospel frame. I'd like for you to elaborate on that a little bit, because I actually think that's a very important observation. Yeah,
I think this has been more of an issue in the States than it has in the UK.
Sure.
Because evangelicalism in the UK has been a minority for decades.
Right.
So we've never really had the same cultural influence.
Was it 2 or 3% people maybe are evangelical in the UK? Is that too low, or is that?
Sounds probably about fair.
Okay.
We have less of a cultural evangelicalism.
Mm-hmm.
The cultural Christianity we get in the UK is very different to the cultural Christianity in the US.
Sure.
It tends to be more formal and institutional and less culturally evangelical. So I think what I've seen in the kind of culture war mentality and posture is we have to fight the cultural forces that are bringing this about. That's our primary way of thinking. So we're all about rebuttal and trying to protect the fortress that is Christendom.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means we are speaking against certain cultural trends. We are pushing back against those things. I'm not saying there's not a place to do that. But I think what it risks doing is it risks completely overlooking the fact that this issue is inside the church and not just outside of it. That it's not just a consequence of, culture going to hell in a handbasket. It's a consequence of the fall.
Mm-hmm.
It's a consequence of the fall. It's going to have its effect on people generally, Christian people no less perhaps. So I think it just means we've missed that pastoral dimension, and where we should have been thinking, let's make sure our own house is in order on this issue. We've just had a message of negativity to the world rather than of pastoral care to the flock.
And it certainly reinforces the us and them distinctions that we were talking about earlier, that it almost frames the discussion that way.
And it risks giving people the impression Christianity really is defined by things we're against.
Mm-hmm.
I heard someone recently say they had been a Christian, someone in the media, and they described their form of Christianity by saying, I was against all the right things. And that is Christianity is a sum of things that you're opposed to.
Yeah, I sometimes talk about, when talking about the way that we sometimes present the gospel, it sounds like coming to Christ is about avoiding certain fates and certain consequences, when in fact it's about far more. It's actually about gaining a relationship that is the core relationship we're supposed to have in the world. And when we flip that, the danger is that when the person makes the decision, they're kind of done. I've avoided all those things.
Yeah, and it's Pharisaical.
Yeah, exactly.
He's defined their spirituality by avoiding the unclean people, the unclean places, the unclean things. And if you do all of that, you are fulfilling righteousness.
Yeah, and
Jesus said they didn't come to him.
Yeah, exactly. So, interesting. Okay, well let's talk about some particular issues. I'll get your take on some particular issues. What would you say, and I'll keep this first question general, what would you say are some of the things we still kind of need to learn?
Oh gosh. Well, this is every single one of us. Being disciples, I mean, we always have much more to learn.
Right.
I'm not pretending I don't have much more to learn on this issue myself. Goodness me, I do. I think we, as a broader evangelical movement, I think I'm encouraged. I think things are very different to where they would have been 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think we still need to learn, and I know I still need to learn, how to cast the Christian stance on this issue in a primarily positive way that secular people can latch onto, rather than simply as the Bible says no.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to think through how we offer people a compelling vision of human sexuality that accounts for and makes sense of the various prohibitions that are involved, but which nonetheless actually gives an inspiring and beautiful vision for human sexuality that can capture the imagination, that can provide a better kind of story than the one our culture is giving us. I would love to be able to do that way better than I've been able to thus far.
Yeah, this is, again, another generic thing that I say that I think fits beautifully here, and that is you used to be, because there was a Judeo-Christian net around, certainly Western culture, be able to get away with saying, well, this is so because the Bible says it. It's true because it's in the Bible, okay?
Yes.
And people would have enough regard for the Bible to take that seriously and to incorporate that into the way they were thinking. That doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't existed in Europe for a long time, but it certainly is starting to fall away here. And so now you have to say it's in the Bible because it's true. And now the explanation is, what makes this true? What makes this an authentic way to live, to go about life, etc.? That's actually a harder thing to do. It moves beyond the imprimatur, to actually this compelling vision, as you've talked about, and the explanation of why would God ask us to do this way?
Yeah. And I think that the urgency I feel on that is not, there's a massive urgency evangelistically, but I'm thinking of how few young people in our own churches have a positive vision of human sexuality that is biblical. And my fear is that there are a whole swathe of under 20-year-olds in our churches that are not remotely convinced by what the Bible says. And even among those who are biblically convinced, they're not emotionally convinced. And so one of the things, I think, one of the tasks before us is to be showing how this is, again, is just what you were saying. This is not just a biblical position, but it's good.
Mm-hmm.
And we want people to taste the goodness of God in this issue.
Yeah, and I think it so swims against the grain of the way sexuality is presented in the larger culture that if your approach is to say, well, we're best not to talk about what's going on in the culture and what's going on around it and just leave it to itself, that then culture eats strategy all the time, and particularly when there is no strategy, and so it's got to almost be addressed and faced and engaged in a fuller kind of way to counter all the signals that are coming, some cases subtly, in some cases not so subtly, particularly towards young people.
No, very much so. So I think we've got a long way to go on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good one.
I feel like even if we don't have the answers, I feel like we're asking the right questions now.
Yeah. Well, that actually raises another question that I think is important here, because sometimes I think people, when you walk into some of these difficult areas, of which this is certainly one that the church faces, the attitude is, well, unless you have the answer, you shouldn't speak. Okay, but I'm becoming more and more, the more time I spend on the cultural engagement side of things and wrestle with many of these difficult areas, I find myself saying, no, part of the journey of growth is hacking through the jungle. Is actually, you may not know what the exact answer is or what the exact approach is, but at least you have some sense of what the direction ought to be. And you're wrestling with the balance of the various factors that are in play, and you are a disciple. You are learning as you go through that, And so this idea that we have to know exactly where we're landing before we can enter in, to me, that's actually a strategy that almost puts you in, how can I say, in pause mode, because you don't make the effort to advance in learning. If you get there, you're so afraid of not having the answer. How important is the mindset of all this to the process of the learning and the growing?
Well, I think I entirely agree with you. It's one of those areas where I'm thinking, I know what I need to be better at. I'm praying. That makes me pray to be better at it. Mm-hmm. But I'm also very, very aware that God doesn't wait for us to be worthy of being used before using us.
Mm-hmm. He sticks us in those situations, and we're off and running.
We're saved by grace, but we serve by grace. Mm-hmm. And God is great at using very imperfect vessels for his ministry. So I want to do things as well as I can, but I mustn't let my awareness of my own limitations, as you say, kind of make me freeze up if doing anything. Otherwise, none of us would have any way of serving at all if we thought, I've got to wait till I'm really qualified, really able, until I've got this nailed. Actually, the people who think, yeah, I know everything on this, I've got all the gifts, I've got this pinned down, are going to be so haughty and arrogant, I don't think the Lord will use them. So I think there's actually a healthiness to feeling like this is beyond us, this is above our pay grade, because it is. And it's just a reminder that the power is in the gospel. God has only ever used very imperfect servants. Mm-hmm. So that really encourages me, because I know I am one.
Okay, that's helpful. I mean, I think one of the things that's hopefully being communicated across the entire conversation that we're having is there really is a need for some, I'm going to say, genuine humility in walking in this space. And even though, I think we both would agree the Scripture seems to be clear about what the standards are to be and what the calling is to be and that kind of thing. The humility that comes with the walk is important in setting the right tone for the conversations that are required, in part because these conversations are deeply intimate, and they are challenging in and of themselves, just to begin with.
And we're treading on, for most people, what is very, very sensitive ground. And so that immediately means we need to have a carefulness and a tenderness. I always keep coming back to the fact that we're told of Jesus that a bruised reed he will not break. And there's a beautiful tenderness to Jesus, that you can bring your most raw, painful bruising to him, and he won't crush you. And we're to be like him in this area. For so many people, the personal narrative includes a certain amount of pain that we must be sensitive to. So I think having a posture of wanting to understand someone as well as we can, as much as they're comfortable sharing with us, we want to be able to listen to their story. And sometimes it might be the first step is not us zapping them with our kind of gospel thoughts on this, but actually just being a really good listening ear, being someone who's interested, someone who isn't treating them as a project, but is treating them as they really are, which is an image bearer of God.
Yeah, you've got to build the credibility and the relational trust to go into those personal spaces that this kind of a conversation requires.
Whereas I think sometimes we've been too quick just to fire off evangelistic grenades, and we've not actually stopped and listened and figured out who it is we're speaking to.
Yeah, I say one of the great tasks in evangelism, particularly with someone who's coming from a completely different worldview space than you are, is to get a spiritual GPS on the person and put your doctrinal and heretical meters on mute. And the point here is not to deny that how you're assessing what you're hearing, but there's a time and a place to have those conversations and to build the bridges so that those conversations have a chance of actually going somewhere is probably one of the most important things you can do in building a relationship with someone.
I think so. Absolutely.
Yeah. Let me ask you a couple of other questions. What are the areas that are kind of the in-house conversations that happen among believers? What do you think those are, and what advice would you give us in how to have those internal conversations in a healthy manner?
Yeah, the two immediate areas that spring to mind, and there will be others as well, but one is, what is the place and type of counselling that comes into play when we're thinking about helping people? Is that there would still be a significant number of evangelicals whose immediate default setting is, as soon as this issue comes up, you need counselling. We will counsel this issue out of you, or that is the primary need you have to move forwards as a Christian. That concerns me because I think that's treating this as an entirely different species of sinful temptation than anything else. What people most need is God's word and God's people, gospel community and gospel truth. So I think where does counselling fit in? And within that, the place of reparative therapy, there are still discussions. There will be Christians who are appalled at the fact that I have hesitations about reparative therapy. Mm-hmm. And I've already, in their mind, stepped over a red line, that I don't believe in the transformative power of Christ. So the kind of the type and extent of change that we think is normative on this is heterosexuality and entailment of holiness. Mm-hmm. I don't think that it is. Others do. That's one area for discussion. Another area of discussion, which has been far more, I guess, visible and pertinent over recent months, is the whole issue of identity. To what extent is gayness something that is theologically neutral, redeemable? Are there categories of that we should and can bring into our existing Christian identity?
So this is how people actually label themselves when they find themselves in this situation, and how we should or shouldn't talk about it.
So that's a huge area where there is still significant disagreement. Mm-hmm. And I've got very dear friends on different sides of that.
Yeah, I do as well. Yes.
So I think that's another one is to what extent is sexual orientation a helpful category, and then to what extent is whatever we mean by sexual orientation, to what extent is that a matter of ontology? Is it like an ethnos? Is this a race? Mm-hmm. And if so, all those issues, there is still.
Is it worth it in thinking about that one? Because actually, when I asked the question, that's certainly one of the ones I had in mind, and I think it's the one that's for some people the most contentious. Does it help to think through what each side is wrestling to affirm in the midst of taking the view that they take, so that the person who's comfortable saying there can be a label such as a gay Christian, and it's an attempt by people, I think, to say, I understand the experience and where you're coming from on the one hand, and I identify with the challenge of gayness, if I can say it that way. But being a Christian to me is the more important of the categories, if I can say it that way. Okay. Whereas the person who says, no, you shouldn't use that terminology at all, says, well, Christ is so determinative for this that to inject the gayness into it introduces a problem that God is actually in the process of trying to solve, or something like that, because we know that same-sex attraction is not God's standard. Does it help to understand what each side is trying to protect in making the
certainly. And the trouble is, we're often using the same or very similar terminology in slightly different ways. And so I've seen this most clearly, I think, over the question of, is same-sex attraction sin?
Mm-hmm.
Because even the question, someone could be meaning one thing by same-sex attraction. Some people mean by it the very experience of lustful thoughts. Others are meaning the temptation as and when it comes. And still others are meaning the capacity to have that temptation.
Right.
Now, until you've landed on which one of those you're talking about, the answer is going to be slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a similar thing with some of the identity language. When someone says gay, we need to figure out what are they meaning by that term.
Mm-hmm.
What are they including under that?
Mm-hmm.
Might be, I think, someone like a Wes Hill would use that term more broadly than other more conservative thinkers do, and say when Wes is talking about gayness being part of identity, he's not just talking about same-sex lust. He's talking about other things too. So you're right, we need to listen really carefully and to make sure we're not just assuming we know what someone means, but actually we're sitting down and making every effort to think, okay, what do they mean by that and what do they mean by that? It can be a slightly pedestrian kind of process.
Which means when we're doing that kind of assessing, that rather than setting kind of this one size rule fits all expressions, actually thinking through what's actually being communicated and wrestling with that a little bit.
I think so. I prefer to think in terms of principles.
Mm-hmm.
What are the principles behind how we describe who we are?
Mm-hmm.
Both in terms of thinking through our identity as those who are now in Christ, also thinking through to what extent we identify with the people that we're seeking to reach, all those things. But the Bible is not silent on, and I see differing principles as we look at Paul's kind of missionary strategy in Acts and that kind of thing. So, but I think the basic thing we're both saying now is, unless we understand what someone really means, we're not really going to interact with them in a faithful way, because we might think, well, I'm reading my definition into your terminology,
mm-hmm.
and then arguing against what I think you would mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
Not really making sure I've heard what you mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
And even when we do all that listening, there are still differences.
Yeah, sure. But I do think it helps to understand. It makes all the difference in the world to think through why someone might be motivated to think through the different terminology than I might want to possess.
What is the? I'm not assuming that because they do something differently to me, they must have some bad agenda.
Mm-hmm.
These are generally good guys trying to do good things. What is the good that they're intending from that? And I might at the end of the day think, well, I kind of want to honour their intentions. I don't think that's a wise way of doing it. So but some of the differences are because we've misunderstood and misheard each other, and others are because we have understood and we still have some differences.
Yes, and in the midst of all this and all the tone and all the discussion we're having, there's an assumption that I think we share about the importance of having conviction about what it is that we do think the Bible is teaching in this area, and trying to honor that in as appropriate a way as possible.
Yeah.
Well, Sam, our time is gone. I really appreciate your taking the time to chat with us about this. And our joke here in the States is that somehow it just sounds more authentic when it comes with a British accent. So,
but yes, I'm into that.
It baits me using a Texas accent. Let's just put it that way. Anyway, we really do appreciate your taking the time to be with us and helping us kind of think through how to engage on what is probably one of the most challenging areas that the church faces today. So thank you very much.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to be with you. I'm grateful for DTS and for what you guys are doing.
Thanks very much. And I want to remind people that if they want to contact us at Dallas Seminary and suggest topics for the table that we might consider, you can email us at dts.edu, the table, dts.edu/the table, and we'll be glad to take those requests, and you can help us think through the topics that we're going to discuss. We thank you for being with us, and we hope you'll join us again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. For more podcasts like this one, visit dts.edu/the table. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.